The winter wind howled across the frozen English airfield as Lieutenant Jack Reynolds tightened his gloves and stared out at the sleek silhouette of his new aircraft. The P-51 Mustang stood gleaming under the dim dawn light, its polished aluminum frame reflecting a sky that was just beginning to turn gray with smoke and clouds. For weeks, Jack had heard whispers about this machine. Some called it the savior of the air war. Others said it was just another experiment in a long line of promises. But as he walked closer, he could feel something different, a quiet power in its design, a purpose in every curve of its wings. Jack had flown P-47 Thunderbolts before, heavy, reliable, but sluggish compared to the swift Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that prowled the skies of Europe. He'd watched friends go down in flames, helpless against the speed and agility of the Luftwaffe. Every mission had felt like a gamble, a desperate attempt to protect the lumbering bombers that carried America's hope across enemy skies. But today was different. Today, he would fly something the Germans hadn't faced before. As mechanics finished fueling the Mustang, Jack climbed into the cockpit. The smell of oil, fuel, and cold metal filled his lungs. His gloved hands touched the smooth controls, and he felt an instant connection. The Merlin engine, a British design built under American hands, waited silently beneath the cowling, ready to roar to life. When it finally did, the sound wasn't just mechanical, it was alive, deep and confident. For the first time, Jack felt like he might actually stand a chance. The briefing that morning had been short but sharp. The 8th Air Force was preparing another deep bombing raid into Germany. The B-17s, flying fortresses, would head toward Bremen, and the fighter escort would go with them as far as fuel allowed. That was the problem. Before the P-51, American fighters simply couldn't reach that deep into Germany. The bombers would be left alone, defenseless, for the most dangerous part of the journey, a slaughter the Luftwaffe exploited mercilessly. The Mustang was about to change that. Its range, speed, and high-altitude performance meant that for the first time, American fighters could escort bombers all the way to their targets and back again. Jack's mission was clear: stay with the bombers, engage any enemy fighters, and bring as many men home as possible. The sun broke through the clouds as the formation climbed. Dozens of silver bombers stretched across the horizon, engines humming in harmony. Above and around them, the Mustangs took their positions. Jack looked to his left. His wingman, Billy Harper, a young Texan with more confidence than caution, gave him a thumbs up. Jack smiled back, though the weight in his stomach remained. Every mission could be your last, and the skies over Germany were littered with reminders of that truth. The radio crackled. "Eagle Squadron, this is lead. Keep formation. Expect contact over the Rhine." The first sign came as black dots against the gray sky. Messerschmitt Bf-109s, diving from above like hawks. The Luftwaffe had spotted them. Jack's heart raced as he gripped the throttle. He could see the sun flashing off enemy canopies. For years, the Germans had owned the skies. Their fighters were fast, their tactics ruthless. But this time, something was different. Jack pushed the throttle forward, and the Mustang surged ahead with a power he'd never felt before. He pulled into a climb, meeting the German fighters head-on. The P-51 handled like a dream, smooth, precise, balanced. When he rolled into a turn, it obeyed instantly. The Merlin engine screamed with life as he dove behind a 109, the enemy pilot trying to twist away. Jack's guns opened fire, 8 .50-caliber rounds tearing through the cold air. The tracers caught the German's wing, then the fuselage, and in an instant, the plane erupted in flame. Jack banked away, his pulse pounding, smoke trailing behind him. Over the radio came shouts, warnings, and cheers. "Mustang on your tail! Brake left! Got him! He's going down!" Where the hell did these guys come from? The Luftwaffe pilots were confused. They hadn't expected American fighters this deep over German territory. Their arrogance cracked in that moment. The hunters had become the hunted. For the first time, the bombers below were not alone. As the formation approached Bremen, Luftwaffe resistance grew desperate. Dozens of German fighters poured into the sky, determined to stop the Americans. Jack's squadron weaved and fought in tight, deadly patterns. Bullets tore through clouds, engines roared, and the air filled with smoke and debris. He spotted a Focke-Wulf 190 breaking toward the lead bomber. He dove hard, his Mustang screaming as it cut through the sky. He lined up his sights and fired. Short bursts, controlled and deadly. The rounds struck true. The 190 spiraled down in fire, and the bomber continued unscathed. His breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes burning from the smoke and sweat. Hours later, as the sun began to dip, the formation turned for home. The bombers were battered, but alive. He counted them as best he could. Fewer than usual were missing. The Mustang had done its job. When they landed back in England, mechanics and crewmen gathered around, their faces smeared with oil and exhaustion, but lit with something new: hope. Word spread fast. The new fighters had gone the distance, shot down dozens of enemy planes, and brought the bombers home. The Mustang wasn't just another plane. It was the answer they'd been waiting for. That night, Jack sat outside the barracks, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. He watched the stars overhead, the faint rumble of engines still echoing in his memory. For months they had fought a losing battle, brave men flying into near-suicidal missions, knowing the odds. But now, for the first time, it felt like the tide might finally be turning. Nearby, a young pilot named George Preddy, already a legend among the squadrons, leaned against the wall. "Not bad for a first time out," he said, nodding toward the hangars. Jack laughed softly. "Not bad at all. She flies like she knows what she's doing." Preddy smiled. "She's going to change everything, you know that." Jack took a long drag of his cigarette and exhaled slowly. "Yeah, maybe we finally get to take the fight to them." In the dim glow of the barracks lights, the sound of mechanics still working on Mustangs carried through the night. Engines whined, tools clanged, and men shouted over the noise. Building, preparing, believing. The air war over Europe wasn't over, but something fundamental had shifted. The Germans could no longer laugh at American planes or pilots. The P-51 Mustang had arrived, and the sky, once owned by the Luftwaffe, was about to change hands. The following weeks blurred into one long, freezing stretch of smoke, oil, and adrenaline. Every dawn brought new missions. Every dusk brought fewer men home. Yet, amidst the chaos, one thing became clear. The P-51 Mustang was rewriting the war in the skies. German intelligence called it der Teufelsvogel, the devil bird. Its long range meant nowhere was safe. Its speed and climb shattered the arrogance of Luftwaffe gases who once ruled the air. For Lieutenant Jack Reynolds, the Mustang had become more than a machine. It was his armor, his weapon, and his only constant companion in a world gone mad. By late 1944, the 8th Air Force had begun to strike deeper into Germany than ever before. Cities like Berlin, Leipzig, and Dresden, once unreachable, were now burning under waves of bombers, escorted every mile by Mustangs. But for every victory, the sky demanded a price. It was December when the snow came. White fields stretched endlessly below, broken only by the black scars of bomb craters and burning towns. The mission that day was brutal. An escort run over Leipzig, deep behind enemy lines. Jack's squadron lifted off just after dawn. His wingman, Billy, ever talkative, crackled through the radio. "Jack, remind me again why we're doing this before breakfast." Jack smirked, pulling his oxygen mask tighter. "Because if we don't, someone else will be eating breakfast under a swastika." Billy chuckled. "Fair point, boss." The radio chatter faded off as they climbed higher into the pale morning light. Ahead, hundreds of bombers shimmered like silver ghosts in formation. The air was so cold that frost crept on the inside of Jack's canopy, and every breath felt like swallowing ice. At 20,000 feet, the first attack came. Messerschmitt 262s, the new German jet fighters. Sleek, fast, and terrifying. They sliced through the bomber formation like knives through silk. The Mustangs had never faced anything like them. "Jesus, they're flying rockets!" Billy shouted as two jets screamed past, leaving vapor trails and chaos in their wake. Jack banked hard, his Mustang groaning under the strain. He'd heard rumors of these new planes, faster than anything in the air, armed with 30mm cannons that could tear through a bomber in seconds. But what they had in speed, they lacked in endurance. The Mustangs still ruled the fight if they could catch them on takeoff or landing. "Stay with the bombers, don't chase them, they'll drag you down," Jack barked. But discipline was hard to maintain in a sky full of fire. One young pilot broke formation and dove after a jet, disappearing into the clouds. Seconds later, smoke bloomed far below. Jack clenched his teeth. Damn it! He rolled his plane to intercept another jet diving toward the formation. Timing it perfectly, he cut across its path and opened fire. The tracers found their mark, tearing through the enemy's tail. The jet exploded into a ball of flame, a blinding flash against the white sky. "Nice shot!" Billy's voice rang out, full of disbelief. Jack didn't answer. His heart was pounding too hard. This wasn't about glory anymore. It was survival. Every second up here was borrowed time. Hours later, when the last bomber turned west for home, the sky was littered with wreckage. The radio was filled with static and broken voices. They'd lost 3 men. Billy was hit, but made it back, trailing smoke and prayer. When they landed, the ground crews were waiting, clapping, shouting. But Jack couldn't join in. He sat in his cockpit long after the engine stopped, staring at the bullet holes in his wings. Each one was a reminder of someone who didn't make it back. That night, the squadron gathered in the mess hall. The room smelled of coffee, sweat, and cheap cigarettes. George Preddy was standing by the window, his face unreadable. He'd downed 5 enemy planes that day, a record. But the look in his eyes wasn't triumph. It was something colder. "They're throwing everything they've got at us now," Preddy said quietly. "Jets, rockets, even kids in those damn training planes. The Reich's running out of men, but they're not giving up." "I know. Neither are we," Jack nodded. Preddy glanced at him. "Just make sure we don't turn into them trying to win." The words hit harder than any bullet. Jack knew what he meant. The bombing campaigns were devastating German cities, killing thousands of civilians. Every pilot wrestled with the same guilt. Were they liberators or destroyers? The next mission came sooner than anyone expected. Berlin. It was the heart of the enemy, a fortress of flak and fire. The Luftwaffe would throw everything they had left to defend it. Command called it Operation Thunderstrike. For Jack, it felt like suicide. The morning of the raid, the air was silent. Men checked their gear without words. Billy tried to lighten the mood with a grin, but his hands trembled as he strapped in. See you on the other side. Count on it. As they roared into the gray sky, the formation stretched for miles. Bombers, Mustangs, and the hopes of an entire war effort. At 25,000 feet, Berlin came into view. A dark scar on the earth, wrapped in smoke and fire. Flak burst around them in black clouds, shaking the air. Every explosion felt closer than the last. Break! Break! Incoming from the east! Dozens of German fighters poured out of the clouds, desperate and furious. Jack rolled left, diving into the melee. Bullets streaked past his canopy. He fired back, catching a 190 square in the engine. It exploded in a flash, but then another was on him. He jerked the stick hard, feeling his ribs crush against the harness. The Mustang screamed as it pulled through the turn. He hit the trigger, but his guns jammed. "Gun jam! Cover me!" Jack shouted into the radio. "I got you, boss." Billy's voice cut through the static. Jack banked low, trying to clear his jam. Behind him, Billy's Mustang streaked past, guns blazing. The German fighter chasing Jack burst into fire, but Billy didn't pull up fast enough. His wing clipped the burning wreck, and in a heartbeat, his plane spun out of control. "Billy, bail out! Bail out!" No response. Only silence. Jack's eyes darted across the sky, but all he saw was a trail of smoke spiraling toward the ground. The rest of the battle was a blur. Jack fought on, his mind numb, his movements automatic. When the mission ended and they turned for home, the empty space on his wing felt heavier than the plane itself. Back on the ground, no one spoke. Billy's bunk stayed untouched that night. His flight jacket hung on the hook, the smell of fuel still clinging to it. Jack sat outside alone, the cold biting into his skin. He lit a cigarette and stared into the darkness. The Mustang had given them victory, but at what cost? He thought of Billy's last grin, of the promise they made. See you on the other side. Maybe, Jack thought, he already had. The wind howled across the airfield again, carrying with it the faint echo of engines, ghosts of men who had flown too high, too fast, for too long. And as he watched the night sky, Jack knew one thing for certain. The war in the air wasn't about machines or medals. It was about the men who dared to touch the edge of heaven and never came back. The sun rose over the frozen airfields of England like a dying ember trying to breathe life into the winter sky. The ground crews moved through fog that clung to the earth like smoke, scraping frost off the Mustang's wings, checking every bolt, every rivet, every bullet feed. For Jack Turner, this had become a ritual of survival. He no longer thought about the days of training or the excitement of flight school. This was war now, stripped of glamour and reduced to seconds of life and death above a shattered continent. The mission that morning was unlike any before. Allied bombers were heading deep into Germany, toward a massive aircraft assembly plant near Leipzig. Intelligence reported that the Luftwaffe had concentrated its remaining fighters there. It would be a test not just for the bombers, but for every Mustang in the air. As Jack walked to his plane, he passed the makeshift memorials, wooden crosses, helmets, and names carved into scrap metal. Friends who had flown once and never returned. He climbed into his cockpit, his breath turning to vapor as he pulled down the canopy. The P-51's Merlin engine came alive with a growl that cut through the cold morning air. The squadron formed up, silver birds lined against the gray clouds, propellers spinning like halos of light. Over the radio, the familiar voice of his wingman, Davis, crackled through. "Let's make it home today, Jack." He didn't answer. He just tapped the photo taped to his dashboard, his father in uniform during the First World War, and pushed the throttle forward. The bombers appeared ahead, dozens of B-17s and B-24s crawling through the sky in perfect formation. Their contrails stretched across the heavens like scars. The Mustangs took their positions above and beside them, scanning the horizon for movement. The tension was palpable. Every shadow in the clouds, every flicker of sunlight, could be an enemy waiting to strike. Then it came. The sky ahead erupted with dark specks that grew larger with terrifying speed. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s diving from above, their cannons flashing. The bombers held steady, their machine guns tracing arcs of light, but the Luftwaffe came fast and coordinated. It was an ambush. Jack dove into the chaos, his Merlin screaming as he leveled on the tail of a German fighter. The Mustang's 6.5 caliber guns roared, a thunder that shook the cockpit. He saw the tracers walk up the enemy fuselage, then smoke, black and thick, burst from the engine. It spiraled down, vanishing through the clouds. Another one appeared from behind, firing short bursts that tore through Jack's left wing. He rolled hard, pulling into a climb that pressed him into his seat. His vision blurred for a moment as he pushed the Mustang past its limits. Over the radio, Davis shouted, "I've got your 6." Seconds later, a German fighter exploded in midair, a bloom of orange and black that scattered debris across the sky. Jack exhaled, barely realizing he had been holding his breath. But there was no time to think. He spotted 3 109s diving toward the bombers. He turned his plane sharply, feeling the G-forces crush his chest, and lined up his sights. One pass, one chance. The first fighter went down in flames. The second tried to break away, but took rounds through its wing and burst into fire. The third escaped into the clouds. By the time the Mustangs regained control of the skies, the bombers had reached their target. Below them, Leipzig burned. The smoke rose so high, it looked like the earth itself was on fire. But as the formation turned back toward England, Jack's eyes caught something that twisted his stomach. A B-17 limping, 2 engines gone, wings riddled with holes. Its crew waved desperately, their plane losing altitude fast. Jack and Davis dropped back to escort them. Over the radio, the bomber's pilot said, "We've got wounded on board, fuel's leaking bad." Jack could see the fire creeping along the fuselage. He stayed beside them all the way to the coast, refusing to break off, even when his own fuel light blinked red. "You're gonna make it," he said softly, though they couldn't hear him. When the bomber finally ditched into the freezing Channel waters, rescue boats were already on their way. That night, when Jack returned to base, the hangars were filled with smoke and silence. Half the squadron hadn't made it back. The mechanics moved like ghosts among the bullet-riddled aircraft. Someone handed him a cup of coffee, lukewarm and bitter, and he just stared at the steam rising from it, feeling the weight of another day survived. Later, in the dim light of the officer's tent, the commanding officer briefed the remaining pilots. "The Germans are getting desperate," he said, "but make no mistake, they're not beaten yet. The next few weeks will decide the war in the air." Jack lay awake that night listening to the wind rattle the canvas. He thought about home, about his father who had fought in France and never spoke of it again, and about the young men in his squadron who still believed they were invincible. He wondered how long that illusion would last. At dawn, the sound of engines starting filled the base again. The Mustangs lined up like a row of steel angels ready to rise into the storm. Jack climbed into his cockpit, feeling the vibrations of the engine through the metal, and for a moment, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, this war could be won, not by machines, but by the men who refused to stop fighting. Far to the east, deep inside Germany, the Luftwaffe's command was in disarray. Their best pilots were gone, their fuel reserves nearly depleted, and every day the sky belonged more to the Americans. But pride dies hard. The German aces vowed to take down as many as they could before the end. And Jack Turner, the boy from Ohio, who once dreamed of just flying, was now the man standing between them and the bombers that carried the weight of freedom. The war was shifting, and the Mustangs, sleek, relentless, and fearless, had become the blade cutting through the clouds of tyranny. And for the first time, even the Luftwaffe knew the skies over Europe no longer belonged to Germany. The war was reaching its breaking point. By early 1945, the Allied air forces ruled the skies, but victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion. Every mission cost lives, and every return to base was marked by the empty bunks that followed. The airfields in England were no longer places of excitement. They were haunted ground. The pilots who still flew did so not out of glory, but duty. Among them was Captain Jack Turner, his Mustang's nose painted with faded kills and his eyes carrying the quiet weight of too many battles. Jack had become something of a legend within the 8th Air Force. His squadron called him the Ghost, not because he was cold, but because he always came back when so many didn't. He had survived dogfights over Berlin, engine fires over the North Sea, and countless runs that seemed impossible. Yet each time he stepped out of his plane, it felt like part of him stayed behind in the clouds, with the friends who never landed again. That morning, word came down. One of the final big pushes into Germany was underway. The bombers were striking targets near Dresden, and the Luftwaffe was throwing everything it had left into the fight. Intelligence said the Germans had begun using desperate tactics, inexperienced pilots in brand new jets, the Me-262s, faster than anything the Allies had seen. The Mustang pilots would have to adapt fast. Jack sat quietly in the ready room, sipping burnt coffee and listening to the briefing officer's voice drone on about altitudes, approach vectors, and radio frequencies. It all blurred into background noise. What mattered wasn't the map or the numbers. What mattered was that they were flying again, into the unknown. Davis was gone now. His plane had gone missing 2 weeks earlier on a mission near the Ruhr. They said maybe he'd bailed out, maybe he was a prisoner. But deep down, Jack knew better. When he reached his Mustang, the ground crew was already loading the ammo belts. One mechanic looked up at him and said, "You're going to bring her back again, Captain." Jack forced a grin. That's the plan. He climbed into the cockpit, feeling the familiar hum beneath him as the Merlin engine roared to life. The propeller spun faster, slicing through the fog, and the squadron began to roll out onto the runway, one by one, rising into the gray morning sky. As they crossed the channel, Jack's thoughts drifted to home. The fields of Ohio, his mother's kitchen window, the sound of rain on the roof. It felt like another life. But the sudden crackle of the radio snapped him back. "Bandits! 3 o'clock high!" The Luftwaffe was waiting. From the edge of the horizon they came, a mix of 109s, 190s, and the dreaded 262s, their jet engines howling like demons. The sky became a storm of motion. Jack banked hard, pulling his Mustang into a climb that strained every bolt. The jets screamed past, faster than anything he had ever faced. But they had one weakness. They couldn't turn tight. He waited for the right moment, then dove behind one as it tried to line up on a bomber. His tracers tore through its fuselage, and it exploded into a fireball. He barely had time to react before another 190 came up on his tail. Bullets tore through the canopy frame, glass shattering across his helmet. He pushed the stick forward, dropping into a near vertical dive. The earth spun wildly beneath him. He pulled up just before hitting the cloud layer, his heart pounding. His wingman, a young pilot named Harris, called out over the radio. "You all right, Ghost?" Jack steadied his breathing. "Still here." The battle raged on for nearly an hour. The bombers released their payloads, the city below engulfed in smoke and fire. The Luftwaffe fought like a cornered animal, fierce but fading. Jack downed another fighter, then another, his ammo running low. He felt every vibration of his aircraft as if it were alive, straining, screaming, refusing to quit. Then, out of nowhere, he saw it.
a bomber hit and trailing smoke, breaking formation. He didn't think twice. He dropped in beside it, matching its speed, even as German guns still flashed below. Through the shattered glass, he could see the faces of the crew, terrified, injured, but alive. He flew with them, keeping the Luftwaffe off their tail until they reached friendly airspace. Only when he saw Allied rescue boats below did he turn back. By the time Jack returned to England, the sun was setting over the airfield. The world was quiet again. The ground crew rushed out, counting bullet holes, patching the torn metal. Someone handed him a message. The war in Europe was nearly over. Rumors said the Germans were collapsing, surrender only days away. But Jack didn't celebrate. He walked out to the edge of the runway and stared at the horizon, where the contrails faded into the darkening sky. When the official surrender came weeks later, there were cheers, parades, tears or joy. But for the pilots who had fought in the skies, victory carried a strange emptiness. The world they had known was gone, and so were many of the men who built it. Jack flew his Mustang one last time, a ceremonial flight over the base. And when he landed, he climbed out slowly, running his hand over the plane's scarred fuselage. The P-51 had been more than a machine. It had been a lifeline, a weapon, a companion. Together, they had faced the fury of the Luftwaffe and survived. Years later, when the war was just a memory told in fading photographs and black and white reels, Jack visited a museum where a restored Mustang stood on display. Its metal gleamed under the lights, polished and perfect. But he knew what it really looked like, covered in soot, oil, and bullet scars. He stood there for a long time, listening to the faint echo of engines that no longer flew, and whispered, "We did it." The P-51 Mustang had done more than rule Europe's skies. It changed the war. It gave the Allies control of the air, allowed bombers to strike deep into enemy territory, and shattered the myth of Nazi air superiority. It became a symbol of American ingenuity and courage, built by a nation that refused to lose. And for every pilot like Jack Turner, it carried the stories of brotherhood, sacrifice, and the endless fight for home. In the end, it wasn't just speed or firepower that made the Mustang legendary. It was the hearts of the men who flew it, men who faced death every day, who kept going when the world was falling apart, and who, against impossible odds, turned the sky itself into a weapon of freedom.